Okay, Guru Nation. Um, I don't know. I read this book twice. Once I listened to it, and then I read about it. Because Edward, I've been doing some biotech investing myself, and it's always nice to figure out the inside scoop on how these things happen, right? Um, I work in clinical research space. The channel is built for clinical research professionals, but there's some overlap with some biopharma investors and just retail investors. We do have some PE and individuals like that watch the show, but I thought, why not read this book again? Because it's literally what it's literally the world I'm in. It's just the business side of the world I'm in. So today we have a very special guest, Edward Van Wezel. He's the managing partner and co-founder at Biogenerations Ventures, and he's featured in the book For Blood and Money. And his story is actually interesting because he's one of the principal architects behind Asserta Pharma, which is the company that rescued the abandoned BTK inhibitor from Merck and ended up getting it sold to AstraZeneca for 7 billion. It's all in the book. I think it's a must read for anyone in our space. And that drug, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Edward, to this day still generates over 2 billion a year. Uh,
Well, yeah, then indeed. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me on and appreciate the invite. Thank you so much. And indeed, it's completely correct. I think the drug currently does more than 3 billion, at least what I've seen the latest report from AZ. And they are hopefully still happy with the acquisition.
well, I'm sure they are, and I'm sure they would need something similar to that soon with the patent cliffs they're facing. And actually, one of the
Absolutely.
reasons
Like all pharma does. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like all
Yeah.
pharma, yeah. I mean, kind of going off script, and I don't know if you even, I'm very interested in this particular drug. Actually, Wayne Rothbaum's involved. It's tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, so Iovance Biotherapeutic.
Iovance story, yes, yes,
Are
yeah. I
you?
wasn't involved. We were not involved in that. So of course we know Wayne from the Asserta days, but he then took on the TILs or the tumor infiltrating lymphocyte
Yes.
as a new story. It hasn't really worked out for them completely, but it's a very exciting bit of science. And I was aware of some successes in the clinic in hospitals here in the Netherlands in Amsterdam with this kind of therapies. So we surely looked at that, but Iovance was one of the front runners in that space, of course. So it was a daring undertaking at the time.
Yeah, it sounded crazy. It kind of still does, although they're slowly starting to fix their scalability issues, and it's a new
Exactly,
paradigm.
that's
So
the issue. Yeah, yeah. It's just I mean, all these cell therapy approaches have the similar kind of challenges there, and I don't think we've solved everything yet. But of course, there is a lot of anecdotal clinical evidence for these kind of
yes,
approaches that looks extremely interesting.
I actually had a patient on who he's still alive. He's a mucosal melanoma survivor. He's seven
Yeah.
years into it now, and he's came on the podcast, wrote a book. So yeah, you are seeing anecdotal evidence. To me, I don't know what you think about Vinay Prasad stepping down, right? This used to be
I
must
really
read.
have. Yeah, I'll be happy to read it. Of course, we follow the news, and FDA is, of course, also for our companies an important
Yeah,
place to go to. It's maybe good to do a quick intro. So our fund really focus on the European early stage investments in biotech. Have been doing this now for 20 years, investing across Europe. We do this from the get-go in combination with Forbion, a larger investor here in Europe that is also investing in the US. But our focus is geographically really focused on Europe. But our companies, of course, have a lot of interactions with FDA in various manners, particularly IND filings, of course, but also ultimately getting drugs approved. Although, given our early stage focus, most of our companies, at least that's our thesis when we invest, can be part, hopefully, of an M&A or an IPO before we really enter the market. That's the
I
typical
see.
VC view on things, and I think that Although currently we have two programs in phase three in our portfolio, sometimes we have to take these drugs further along.
Yes, that's actually I'm interested in that as well. Are there any particular therapeutic areas you guys invest in or?
No, so our focus is really biotech across the board. So no therapeutic area focus. We of course look at different therapeutic areas really on an opportunistic manner. So if we believe there's something really novel, cool going on there that we think could mean something for patients, then we'll have a very serious look at it.
Interesting.
We are in from oncology to ophthalmology, I&I, and rare
Okay,
disease as well. So it's many different indications.
that's awesome. The one European company I have some holdings in is Atai Beckley, the psychedelic.
Ah,
Um,
yes,
Christian Angermeyer, I guess he
yes.
was one of the
We're
co-founders.
not in that company. So,
No, no, yeah, I
no,
figured, but
yeah.
there's some interesting stuff coming out of Europe too that I think people on this
Well,
side of
yeah.
the pond don't they don't realize
Maybe
or
it's
maybe
good to,
appreciate.
highlight that a little bit in terms of our investment thesis, right? But why are we focusing on Europe? Is that one of the reasons is that you see, if you just look at the publications or even patent filings, we're not very different from what's happening in the US, for example. And the translation, however, of those inventions and new science to business, Europe has been traditionally always been lagging behind the US. There's many reasons, particularly capital is one of the most, and risk capital is one of the most prominent reasons, and the lack thereof. Um, so the opportunity we feel is still quite significant versus what's happening in the US. So and not a lot of specialized investors out there in Europe that really look for stage
Okay.
investment opportunities. So that's why we think the opportunity is so interesting
So do
here.
you think it's underserved in that regard when it comes to early
Yes, I think
early?
there is a lack of, compared to the US at least, there's certainly a lack of capital, know-how. We don't have a public market here of any, I mean, so biotech companies from Europe typically go to Nasdaq.
Yeah.
So when they think about an IPO, as you have, we've seen a Belgium company only in the last was it 2 weeks ago, Agomap going public. A company that was founded in Belgium and does an IPO in the US because there's really no opportunity here in Europe to do that. Those markets are not sophisticated enough. The capital is not there. The analysts are not there. So
Mm.
of course we'd like to build that. So I think I'm a big proponent of trying to get that done here in Europe, but that's so far we have not been able to get it done, and we can't do it alone. But the ambition is there. The
That
ambition is there.
sounds like a massive undertaking. Uh,
Oh yeah, no, that will take more than a couple of decades, I'm afraid. Yeah,
yeah, that looks to sound like some generational efforts
yeah,
needed to
yeah,
pull
yeah,
that
absolutely,
off.
absolutely. But nevertheless, it's important to note because I think it will be important, for us to be able to also get that capital here. One of the things that we run into, for example, the institutional capital like pension funds tend to invest in US for
Right.
if they look for example, for venture capital allocation in the portfolio rather than Europe.
Yeah.
Uh, which is, of course, yeah, you could say a bit odd, at least, to have a good look at what is going on in Europe, given the opportunity. So that is something that we're trying to stimulate and talk to those people and make them understand that over the last couple of decades in Europe, we have built quite a nice ecosystem for our sector, and it's
Hmm.
still growing. So there is also a nice opportunity for them to invest.
Yeah, no, that'd actually be interesting. I know Robinhood, this is going the other direction, but to get retail investors from
Yeah.
Europe interested in stocks, to make it easy, they've kind of made their app structured in a way where it's like tied to the US dollar, but you still get to own some shares. So I think Europe would benefit from something like that. It's actually surprising that when I actually think about it, that it doesn't exist there. We take it for
Yeah.
granted here, I think. And the
Maybe a little bit.
majority of Americans still don't invest anyways, but you
Hard to
know,
comment for me, but going back to FDA, of course we have interactions with them, but I mean, and we follow with a lot of interest what's happening in their organization and so forth. But I mean, it is a bit, it's not something that we can influence from our side.
well, the reason I brought it up, he's is a wild card. He's resigning in April now for the second
Yes,
time, right?
yes,
And
yes, I
I
saw
don't
that.
think
Yeah,
it's must read anymore, but when he was in charge, so basically single arm frowned upon from him, must be double blind, randomized, essentially like no surrogate endpoint. Everything Io Vance was doing is like against this guy's thesis. So he's gone, and I don't know. To me, that was a de-risking event that people are not talking enough about.
Hmm.
Just wanted to
Yeah,
get your
yeah,
your
yeah.
take.
No, I think I agree. I think, I mean, for these really novel therapies, it is very difficult to do that kind of
Yes.
design. So, and there are other ways to do it. So it's not impossible, I believe.
So your origin story is interesting because y your background's unusual for a venture capitalist. You're not a finance guy. From what I'm aware of. You have two master's degree, chemistry and biochemical engineering. So you're
Correct.
very much on the hard science. You started as a process engineer at Chiron,
Yeah,
and
we call it Chiron. Actually, it was a Bay Area company of the
that
old day. Yeah.
okay. But
Yeah.
you were a process engineer there. Like what? Walk me
Yeah, so
through the.
they had a small manufacturing pilot plant basically in Amsterdam, where we worked with those were the days of recombinant yeah, IL-2 and beta interferon out of E. coli.
Okay.
Not products that have survived the long term, but at the time that was really cool new science, and they had products on the market, right? The IL-2 was on the market, beta interferon got approved for MS. A lot of side effects, a dreary product in the end, and we've come a long way for these patients. But so I'm talking early 90s of this last century. So this is a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
But yes, that's my origin, and indeed,
But
and
how do you
it was interesting to work for companies like that at that time. A lot of stuff was happening.
I'm just fascinated how you go from like the almost like a bench scientist, right? I don't know if that's exactly what you were doing, but to venture capital. Like a lot of people probably have that same career, like the scientist part, and never even dream venture capital. Like how did you get to that stage, and was it intentional? Was it by accident? Was it a mixture of the two? Like how does one do that? Because most bench scientists don't, they just remain bench scientists, right?
Yeah, so well, I of course was more on actually on the manufacturing side. Ultimately, I worked a couple of years with Johnson and Johnson at Janssen Pharmaceutica in the Belgium side in the north of Belgium, and I got involved in project management and got a little bit more exposure to what it actually is to develop a drug,
Mm,
working with both preclinical and clinical teams and manufacturing to get drugs into the clinic, particularly in oncology at the time was my task. And then I moved to a small startup here in the Netherlands that was working in metabolic disease, was a university-based startup from the University of Amsterdam that I was able to sell ultimately as a CEO to Genzyme.
wow.
And that was nice. And of course, in that period, I got some interactions with investors because we needed money to develop that drug. It was ready to go into the clinic when we sold it. And this is how contacts were established with a couple of these investment groups across Europe. And one of them, when they heard that I sold the company, asked me if I would be interested to work with them on a fund focused on early stage investments, initially local, and then later we were able to expand to the whole of Europe. But um,
Mm.
so yeah, I would say if you say coincidental, somewhat. There's always some serendipity in these kind of developments. It's not that I was looking for it. I did start out my career with the idea to be involved in biotech companies, but the exact role I didn't have in mind when I started.
I
So
see.
it sort of occurred, and the opportunity came by. I grabbed it, not really knowing much about the specific of to be an investor, but I mean,
Hmm.
uh, I think the combination of doing these investments and the science, I think that's still super interesting to be involved in. So
Yeah,
that
it's kind
is
of a
gets
rare.
me out of bed every morning to get these to work with these small companies and to build those companies and working on some cool new science that hopefully can be beneficial for patients in the end.
Yeah, it's like the triple threat. So the science, the hard science, the clinops or the managerial aspect, like the project management aspect, and
Yeah,
then the financing aspect.
absolutely.
Those are
Yeah,
the three pieces
that's
I
still a lot
think.
of fun then. So I really enjoy that. So
So do you think the project management, so we have a lot of project managers watching.
yeah,
Do you think that's a good on-ramp to get to? Because it seems like it's so versatile. Like from PM, you can kind of go in any
yeah.
direction.
Well, I think it's super important to have an understanding of what it takes to develop a drug and to get it into the clinic and to do clinical trials and what it all means, right? To
Hmm.
understand the intricacies, to be able to make proper interpretations of data that you get from let's say a small company that has had some data, maybe have some preclinical data, some nice animal model data, whatever, and now you're asked to invest a significant amount of money to get this drug into the clinic. So how do you go about and how do you assess that? And so yes, I think that's a very interesting profile to have for sure. If that can be combined with a good scientific background, which these people usually have, right? So most of
Hmm.
them are PhDs. I'm not, but most of them are. Um, so that's a very good background to have, I would say, to have a good understanding of that. And it's interesting to see that we do see that in biotech VC, but not everybody. So it's not a very common profile.
So yeah, the fact that you're not a PhD, because many of us watching are not either, but to learn enough of the science to
Yeah,
where you're not going to believe anything that's pitched your way, right? Because there's a lot of the science is like they only show the good stuff, they
of
ignore the
course.
bad stuff, and you kind of have to be able to know enough to discern, hey, I don't know exactly the mechanism here, but I know it's not as simple as it's sounding. Is that like the basics of what you need to understand?
Yeah, so maybe the whole Asserta story is a nice. I can give you a
Yeah,
nice
yeah.
example. So if just to tangent back to that.
Yes.
So when we started out, this was 2011 or so. We knew we had a pretty specific compound, but we weren't really sure if that was a good idea or a bad idea to hit more than just one or two kinases, or that you would need a little bit more than that. And if you looked at the profile on the kinome screens of ibrutinib, it was a little bit less specific for certain kinases than this compound that we were licensing for Merck at the time. And if talking to all the KOLs and people that knew about this particular field in the kinase inhibitor space, nobody really had a good idea whether this was could be positive or negative. I mean, you can philosophize about potential less side effects, of course, but maybe you need also to inhibit certain redundant pathways. So, I mean, it's probably a balance. And in the end, it turned out relatively positive for us in the sense that that specificity showed that there is a very limited amount of side effects compared to, at that time, the competitor drug that we knew a little bit of data of. And that gave, together with the relatively fast onset of effect that we saw in the clinic, gave the confidence for people to put money in this program. So it shows you that science and interpretation of data and knowing, trying to understand exactly what the effect will be of a compound when you actually use it is something that you have to keep a very close eye on and understand and try to get your data on as soon as possible.
Yes, and you had a big part in that part of the book where Asserta Merck absorbs Organon. I remember Organon because as a
Yeah.
clinical research site owner, we actually one of my first studies was a schizophrenia trial with
Okay.
Organon in
Oh,
2005 or
oh, wow.
2006 around that time, and
Okay.
I was like, this is a weird logo. They got a reindeer on it, and what is this thing? And then
Yeah.
it's turned out it was a big company with the shearing plow came in, and then they
Yes.
wanted to shut down the facility that you were you working there or
No, no, no.
okay.
So just to be completely clear, so the whole idea of Acerta and the idea to get these company compounds out of Merck was not mine. It was from two of the employees that were getting fired, Alat Kaptein and Tjeerd Barf.
Barf-
So they're also prominently featured in the book, of course. And they came to me with a plan to okay,
mm,
how we know that these drugs are somewhere on a shelf at Merck, and we're getting fired, and there is
mm,
the opportunity to potentially license those from Merck because Merck doesn't see any future for for this compound. So it's not just a BTK inhibitor, there were a couple of kinase inhibitors at the
mm,
time. And the plan was to do something with based on this covalently binding approach. The whole idea was, can we use these covalent binders? And Merck said, well, that's too dangerous. Covalently binding is, there's no way back. So if you have a side effect, you can't really do anything anymore. So we see it too much of a risk. So as a sort of uh, um, uh, general rule, they didn't want to use those covalently binding drugs. So that's
mm,
but Organon slash sharing plow had developed this for an anti-inflammatory condition. They had some data on RA models, and that's what we had. But of course, we knew what ibrutinib had been publishing, or pharmacyclics had been publishing, and it looked like that the inhibition of BTK could be very meaningful in indications like
right,
CL.
because pharmacyclic was a little bit ahead. I'm
Yeah, they were
remembering the
ahead.
book now. Now what but why would these two employees, Barf and Captain, why would they come to you? Like what made it
Yeah,
I feel
their
like that's
coincidence.
important.
Yeah, their coincidence uh, 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 sometimes plays a role, right? So, of course, we were already operating as an investor for a couple of years in the Netherlands. I mean, but and I think that's also featured in the book a little bit. So, I'm part of a group of a little club of runners, and one of those guys met Allard in this case at the side of a soccer field when both of their sons were playing a game of soccer. And Allard was complaining about the fact that he was getting fired. And then my friend said, well, why don't you talk to Edward at BGV? Maybe he can help you. So this is
Mm.
how we got into a first conversation with these guys.
Now at this point, I imagine you're getting pitched a lot, so you must have a filter that gets rid of the bullshit versus like what you actually think is promise. And not that it's always good, I'm sure you make mistakes, but what
Of course we.
made
Yeah.
what made this one I imagine you say no to much more than you say yes. So what made this one interesting to you at the time? Were you already aware of what Pharmacyclics was doing?
We were,
Okay.
and I think that was the reason. So the reason was there is this particularly preclinical data that showed that BTK could be a very effective drug in these animal models. Even if we're 1 or 2 years behind, if we have a proper drug, we could potentially still sell it, right? Because in this market, if even if you're second to market, you could still have a fair chance as long as you have some differentiation, at least, or are as good as ibrutinib for in this particular case. So that was in a way, the gamble that I took because we didn't have the data to show for it, but there was because the drug was developed in a pharmaceutical company setting, they
Mm,
had a proper set of data already, which is
right,
a bit more rare if you would look at kind of like an academic spin out or so. They would not have done all the work
right, Right.
do a Herc test or do
That's a
some
good point.
PK, some initial talks, all that. That was already done. So we had a file basically, it's a set of data available that was helpful to understand this
Interesting.
may be a drug, and now we actually develop it in a way that we stand a chance potentially bringing this drug to market.
I see. So it's like it's almost like a perfect situation where you're reading about this other company you have no investments in, you're just reading because it's interesting, BTK inhibitor. And then this guy from a soccer game ends up to you, and
Yes,
they're not from somebody's garage, they're from a big pharma. And you're
correct.
like, okay, potential opportunity.
Yeah, but
But
then of course there are still many hurdles
yeah,
to overcome, and one of them is to get it financed and to get it properly financed so you can exercise a level of speed that is needed to be competitive in this market because we knew this was not the only BTK. Pharmacyclics didn't have the only BTK. There were more drugs already in development at the time. And one of them was sold to Genzyme for I believe 900 million in biodollars, right? So it was not that that field was completely empty. So I had to convince my partners at BGV to take this chance and spend more work and time and try to see if we could build a company around this idea of
and
this
move fast, right? This
yeah, and
was
move very fast. Yeah.
it's probably not as big as the GLP-1 craze, but it's maybe comparable. Like there's a lot of
No,
space,
I think that it's certainly not as big,
Right, right.
but in terms of deal sizes, of course, in 2014 or 15, Pharmacyclics was sold to AbbVie for 20 billion or something like that
Yeah,
amount.
yeah.
And that, of course, set the scene for the BTK space. And there were a couple of contenders. And I mean, currently in the market, there are quite a few. And
Hmm.
also, BTK is, of course, also being used in other indications now outside of oncology. So it's still a very active space. Um, but we took the chance to get this going. And then after talking to a few people in our network, and of course, me stumbling into a team of ex-pharmacyclics people that have actually had already brought the pharmacyclics drug into the clinic, which was to a large extent coincidence. This was at the JPM meeting
Right.
in San Francisco where I met this group, and convincing them to collaborate with us. Uh, Things changed dramatically because they also had contacts for on the financing side in the US. In particular, this person Wayne Rothbaum that we talked about earlier, that then also came in relatively early, quite early actually, uh, to also support the effort.
And I want to get to that, but before
Yeah.
when you're trying to extract the IP from Merck, um,
Yes.
what does that conversation look like? Do you look at it from the outside thinking this is a long shot, they'd rather just shut it down than than waste time selling it to anyone or how
Yeah, I
does that?
mean, I think in general, pharmaceutical companies are less inclined to start out licensing their IP, right? So they're not. In this case, we had a little bit of help in the sense that because Merck was closing down this facility, Dutch government was complaining at Merck and said, "Hey, you need to do something for these people that you are firing here. A couple of thousand people are getting fired. Can you help us and maybe give them the opportunity to build new companies or do whatever based on some of the stuff that you may not be interested in to develop?" I mean, part of this story is, of course, also Keytruda that they almost licensed out at the time, right? So which on
Wow.
hindsight would have been a mistake because Organon also originated that drug, which is of course, and even if you look back, of course, and currently still a huge drug. So
Oh, it's every day. It's that's the benchmark anything's compared to.
absolutely, absolutely. So at the time we were put into contact with somebody in New Jersey from Merck licensing department, BD department, that was supposed to negotiate the contract with us. they had no clue who we were as BGV. They didn't know, of course, the founders either. And it took us quite a while, with some major up and downs in those discussions, um, to get that license done. So it really took a
Wow.
long time. So it was a
Well, that's
long
one.
discussion from yes, we're going to license this to you. So no, we're going to not license it to you. To back to maybe, but only the oncology rights.
Uh-huh.
Then to okay, and these are the terms non-negotiable. To ultimately what it came down to, and ultimately we of course were able to negotiate on hindsight an extremely attractive deal. But that was only in hindsight that we can say that.
Well, thank God, in one case at least, thank God for the government intervention. 'Cause
Oh
otherwise,
yeah, but the government, I mean, I don't, yeah, at what levels, and there's a lot of people that played a role here, so I'm not going to name names because there's a lot of people that were involved in all this
yeah,
in the background to try to help these kind of initiatives at the time to take form. But for sure, it's helpful at that point in time that somebody in politics has a bit of a contact that can
yeah.
be leveraging on a big pharma like that is also concerned about their reputation, right? So they also don't want their reputation to be squandered.
This is some where I want to get to the JPM thing, but I think one of the things I wanted to ask Nathan, the author,
Yes,
um, is this kind of a just maybe this story of Asserta, if it was chosen at random, is it typical of like the roller coaster that most of these ultimately successful biotechs go through, or was this
I
one had extra special ingredients to it? What do you think?
listen. Then I think every success has its own story for sure, and most of them we don't really hear about, right? So
Yeah.
not the finer details, and I think when Nathan Fardy came to me, he's the author of the book,
Hmm.
came to me with the idea. I'm fine. I was fine with it. There's always confidentiality issues and things that you can and cannot say. Of course, by now it's 10 years ago, a lot of water under the bridge. But
Hmm.
I was, of course, happy that he wanted to tell the story because it was a unique story for me
Hmm.
personally and for a lot of people, for all those people that were involved. And I think these kind of concrete stories about how these things actually happened in real life can also be very entertaining for people that are not part of the story, but are just and particularly people in the business. So,
Yeah.
like yourself, I mean, the deal was done 10 years ago, and the book was written a few years thereafter, and I still get, like your invite, I still get people
Yeah.
asking me about it. So I think it was special. The size of the deal was special. The speed at which we developed was very special, was
Mm.
very fast. In 3 years, we went from 5 million pre-money valuation or less to 7 billion. It was super fast. That makes it very special. And I always tell people I would like to do it again, but
Yeah.
I haven't been able to yet. So
I see. Yeah, and back then, 7 billion a decade ago is not 7 billion today anymore. That would be in today's money significantly more. And yes, I have always wondered about that. But okay, so I think this story has a lot of like interesting character. Wayne Rothbaum is one that you mentioned.
yes.
So the JP Morgan conference, I assume you go regular every year, or do you ever miss a
Yeah,
year? Or...
I think over the last couple of let's say 15 years, I think I've been there. Yes, more or less every year. So for us, although it's evolving a little bit after COVID, for sure. I mean, it's not a discussion, but yes, we typically are there. I was there, this was I think 2011. And so a long time ago,
Mhm.
may have been 12. And then I see somewhere in the conference book this group of people that wanted to talk to investors about a BTK inhibitor. They wanted they had in-licensed or wanted to in-license from I think the Huntsman Institute in US. And I figured, well, why don't I have a chat with these people, see if what they think about this asset that I was then working on together with the two founders from what ultimately became Asserta.
Hmm.
So that was the reason I sort of barged into their hotel room. I had no clue really about their backgrounds. I didn't know the finer details about where Ahmed Hamdi and Francisco Salva and Raquel Izumi had worked, specifically what they had done, and that they were at that time fired by Bob Duggan
Yeah.
and looking to build a new company with an alternative BTK inhibitor. Uh, but the conversation was very entertaining, and I think there at that point, of course, we decided, okay, let's meet up with the two founders from the Netherlands.
And
Uh,
is that
and
where Wayne Rothbaum you met him?
I met him later. I met him
Ah,
later. He was brought in by Ahmed. Ahmed knew him because he had been an active investor in pharmaceutics as well. So he
yes.
was brought in later. Yeah, yeah,
That's an interesting character. I think most people are curious to learn more about him, and from your interactions with him,
yeah.
what are your thoughts?
Well, I think ultimately, if you want to give somebody the credit for the success of this company, I think for sure Wayne is one of the, or if not the most important person
Wow.
that has pushed this drug into the clinic with the, let's say, the intensity at which he was active in the company. He was the chairman of the board, but essentially he was running the show. And he
Yeah.
put a lot of his own money at risk as far as well as, and I think he made a good amount of money out of the deal. But with all respect, because he pushed his company extremely hard, was able to convince other investors to come in. We did
Hmm.
a couple of financing rounds. The last one was a 375 million financing round in I think in May 2015. I mean, those kind of things. And he was, of course, a very experienced hedge funds manager, basically from New York. So he had the contacts to do all that. But also in the beginning, and he was extremely focused on the finer details of the science. He knew much more than I did about the whole kinase space in general. He always told me that when it comes to clinical investigators, for example, he didn't only wanted to know them, but he wanted to know the name of their wives and their dogs,
Wow.
figuratively speaking. So understand these people, have a relationship with them, get their honest feedback on the data, make sure that they and so it was a very important factor in the success of Asserta for sure. Yeah,
That level of attention to detail, that's like
yeah.
an obsession, right? Like you can't manufacture that. It's either
Well, he told
intrinsic
me he
or
spent a lot of, I mean, if not all of his time on Asserta at the point. So that I think that indicates to you that he was very much focused on this, and for sure, yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And that's
And I
why
think
he's
that,
like
that
this.
yeah may have been the basis of the success if you look at it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah, I think every company needs someone like that where, I mean, he's willing to have the tough conversations with people, willing to move quickly rather than wasting money if something's not working. I think most people
exactly.
are too nice or too, I guess, amicable or care too much about what other people think. And he's like, listen, at least from what I read in the book, he doesn't care if you need to get rid of people or push them harder. And
I know he provided input to Nathan Vardy himself to the book, so
mhm.
a lot of that is also
Wow.
from the direct source, so to speak. So I think then the book speaks for itself about his character indeed.
Do you think there's a lot of him out there, or he's like a one of one?
I think he's everybody. Everybody has their unique self, of course, but I don't think there's a lot of copies of Wayne Rothbaum out there. No, I don't think.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the reasons I'm in Iovans, he's not the main reason. He was like a nice icing on the cake after. Oh, he's involved too. Wow, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I
yeah.
know he's done his homework. Like I can like rest more assured if he's involved. So he does
Yeah.
bring a level of like almost insurance to a company when he's
That's
in.
of course how a lot of investors followed him, of course.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and he's also a great salesman, so that helps. But I mean, he goes very deep into detail, and he typically knows very well what he's talking about, although he has no background in science
None.
whatsoever.
Yeah, all self-taught,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is interesting. Do you think I think the science actually harder to learn than the finance, but
Yeah, well, I mean, but I mean, if you go into detail, if you're, I mean, it's not that it's all. These things are not. Um, People can explain what a Western blot is to somebody who doesn't understand science, right? So, and that's
yeah.
the level of detail he wanted to. When he looked at data, he wanted to not only understand, and that's I think I learned from him a little bit. At least I hope I learned from him is that when people present you some data as you earlier alluded to, you really want to understand the data in depth. So
Hmm.
not just look at the graph and say, okay, that's interesting, there's a trend, but what are we really looking at? What does the y-axis and the x-axis exactly tell me?
Hmm.
And to what extent does the standard deviation tell me anything about this experiment? And was it properly set up? Was there a proper control? All these questions that you need to ask before you make a conclusion about the data set.
Yeah.
Uh, that's what at least I fool myself to tell myself that I learned that a little bit from people like him because he was really good at that. So yeah,
Obsessive. My
yeah,
dad, who's a psychiatrist, he taught me one of the things I remember early in my
yeah,
childhood is the rules. Everyone learns the rules, but when you become an expert, you learn the exceptions, and that's the things you don't see. That's
yeah,
what you need to
yeah,
focus
yeah.
on. So I
Yeah, but
think
I mean, he also, and I think that's also what we as venture capitalists, of course, try to do is to bring in people that we trust to can make a proper interpretation about, for example, a set of tox data, or whatever. How do you get the tox study in front of you, your phase one data, but you need to make an interpretation, right? You need to understand how does this affect my choices going forward for this particular program. And I think he also really made a point to bring in the right people with a lot of experience to help there because of course I mean nobody knows everything, right? So and there's also some experience needed to make that kind of interpretations.
did he, at the time of these meetings, was he pitching you, or were you more trying to get in, or was it like, how did it actually
So,
become
well, of course, we pitched him the story, or the
okay?
scientist initially pitched him the story. He had a couple of questions. He saw some gaps, of course. I mean, we didn't have a full preclinical data set. We didn't have the 28-day talks or whatever. Um, there were questions about some of the biology experiments, but I think what he got a sense of the compound initially quite quickly that it was potentially something really interesting. And then after that, I think he basically his main goal was to drive it forward really fast. So
Hmm.
to get into that competitive race.
And you
Uh,
knew how to build a team as well, being a CEO and project manager. I mean, you knew all the pieces needed. Did
yes,
he
so
have a solid idea of like the pieces needed, or he
I, I think so because he brought in a lot of people that he knew from his Calistoga investment days, for example. So he had been in Calistoga. The deal with Gilead had relatively recently been done. So some of these people were out there or still at Calistoga, and he convinced them to come over. So those are people that he had experience with. So I mean that's very important. And we built the team. So to be very clear, the team was not in the Netherlands, right? So we had a few people here that did further work on the chemistry mostly and some biology,
hmm
but the whole clinical development was based in South San Francisco.
hmm
So not where pharmaceutics originally had been. So we had some ex-pharmaceutics people, we had people from other pharmas and biotech companies, but that
hmm
and some of them I don't know, living in Seattle or wherever, because that's where Calistoga was. So I mean, there was a group of people that was built around the asset within a reasonably short time frame. Yeah.
When a group like yours gets involved in a deal like that, do you personally, do you make frequent traveling to San Francisco, or do you guys just do, because this was before Zoom meetings, right? Like Zoom
This was
wasn't
before.
really Zoom wasn't really a thing. You just pick up the phone and
No,
call
no.
someone, right?
Yeah, it would be. I would have lengthy calls with Wayne on the phone, for example, for my attic in my home here in the Netherlands. We had board meetings, of course, on a regular basis, so that I would travel over to the US to have those board meetings,
Okay.
and maybe spend some additional time with some of the team members. That was about it. I mean, and of
Okay.
course, I tried to make sure that the team here in the Netherlands was also taken care of. So I visited them on a sort of regular basis as well.
I see. What was your team's role in this company?
I personally was on the board
Okay.
for until the exit, and that was it basically. So
Okay.
we of course in the initial days we invested uh, from our fund in the company, obviously. And then when things got to really large funding, we couldn't really follow anymore.
Hmm.
But I was in the board until the end, until we sold the company. So that was the main role after
Hmm.
Wayne came in and the whole
So
thing
pre
started
pre
moving
Wayne,
really.
you guys really did the heavy lifting. There would be no company without you guys. And then post Wayne, he kind of took over, and you were on the board, but it became
Yeah.
more of a management for you just to go board meetings and things like that.
Yes, of course, in the meantime, you have discussions with some of the stakeholders, with
Sure.
Wayne, with other investors, with some of the team members. But yes, that's a good summary. Yeah.
Okay. And would Wayne call you and say, "Hey, start shopping this around, see if there's interest, things like that"? Because imagine
Yeah,
he's,
and in due course, of course, once
yeah.
we got the first initial data out, and what we basically did in our phase 1/2 trial was to copy more or less what pharmacyclics had done, and then show that we were as least as good in a kind of similar patient population in CLL. And when
Okay.
we were able to publish that data ultimately in 15 at ASH, um, of course, there were already all kinds of discussions going on with strategic parties to potentially acquire this. And
Hmm.
after what had happened to pharmacyclics, of course, this was an obvious field of interest for many pharma companies. So there was a lot of interest in this drug. And once we had the validation from the data where we showed a PFS curve that showed 100% progression-free survival in an ongoing studies, but still that looked very enticing, of course. That looked extremely, at that time,
Hmm.
that was a very convincing data set.
Yeah,
I
even
still have the
Vinay.
poster here in my room. Yeah.
Wow, even Vinay Prasad would be not wouldn't have issues with that one.
I don't
Uh,
think so. I don't think so. No, no,
Where
no,
you
no.
guys use surrogate endpoints, or overall survival was also looked at, right? Oh,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah,
Overall, it was a typical oncology study. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. And then so Dugan, did you ever meet with him, interact with him?
Personally, I didn't. I've heard a lot about him.
Mhm.
I've read the book, of course.
Yeah.
I saw him walking around once at Ash, but that's about it.
Okay.
And he had quite an entourage, but it's a very special man. But I've never spoken to him. No,
He's
no. He
another
was,
guy
of course.
similar to Wayne.
He was, yeah, of course, he's also an extremely interesting person if you go to his background and the fact that one of his drivers was really that his son died of a,
Yeah.
of a brain tumor, right? So,
Hmm.
so I think he's and the way he ran the company, I heard some tidbits of information from my colleagues at the time, from the people that had worked for him. Uh, Also, certainly not the easiest boss to work for, I would say, in summary. But nevertheless, I mean, he got this done, and I mean, that's amazing,
He
of
sounds
course.
like a different style than Ralph. I have a friend who's actually a project manager, and she works
Okay,
for Summit. She works for him.
okay,
And she tells me stories like, yeah, when this dude gets on a Zoom call or he comes into San Francisco, it's like a celebrity, like everybody stop what they're doing and you can feel, and he's in his 80s. And she said, all us young people, in our 30s, like we can feel the energy, and when he leaves, we're like, he's 80, why can't we be like this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
I think it's
You need really special people I mean, ultimately, if you go back also in the book, I think it's mentioned that the way they ultimately stumbled on this drug, right, and then stumbled on the indication is very interesting. But the way he executed this and pushed it and was able to ultimately get the
hmm
deal with J&J and then again sell it to AbbVie, it's quite amazing and
hmm
has meant a whole lot for the patient community as well. We shouldn't forget that, right? So the treatment paradigm for these CLL patients has definitely changed.
yeah.
We now have first line therapy with this kind of compounds with much less side effects, quite long therapy periods where these patients can be on these drugs. I think that has been a major change.
Well, that's always gonna feed the demand,
Yeah.
having, I mean, ultimately we are all patients too. Regardless of what career path we all end up becoming patients at some point. Unfortunately, some sooner than others, and some more severely impacted than others. But
Yeah.
we all on that track. I find interesting that Rothbaum and Dugan are still kind of competing in a way, indirectly. Like
Yeah, the
Summit,
psychology of that you should maybe ask your father, but I don't know about it. So, but I think for sure there is this billionaire kind of competition, if you want to call it like that. But I mean, these people so driven in what they do, they
yeah,
always want to show that they can do it again, and of course, and that makes
yeah,
sense to a certain extent. I would.
it makes
It's
sense. I think you need a certain intrinsic motivation, but you also external motivations certainly help. And when you find somebody, because like the Dugan's doing non-small cell lung cancer with the summit, and then
yeah.
well, not indirectly anymore, but Wayne with Iovance, they're also in that indication
Yeah, and
amongst
he's
others.
also involved in two other companies that I'm aware of, at least. So, also still two private companies. So he's
Ah,
still
okay.
active, but I've not been maintaining a
Hmm.
lot of contact with him.
Okay. Do you think he would be a like for BGV? Do you think he's like a somewhat of an asset, or but you don't really communicate, right?
No, I think it's more it's the history and the fact that we have been involved together
I
in
see.
this success, right? So yes, for sure. Uh, but I don't think he will be interested quickly to invest into a European company, let alone
Mhm.
a European fund. That would probably not be his cup of tea, and he would want to have control.
Yeah, and he's all seems to be most only oncology, right? From what I understand.
Well, he
Uh,
spent a lot of time there, so he knows his way there. Yeah,
hmm
yeah,
hmm That makes sense. The I think the AstraZeneca buyout in 2015 for 7 billion, right? Extraordinary outcome, like we said, even even today, that's extraordinary. But
yeah,
a decade ago, that was serious money. There were disputes about how the equity was structured. The book is pretty clear about this. I was having as a reader, it's like easy to find a argument on both sides of this.
mm,
Because you're kind of an impartial observer, but you're like, well, yeah, you got to treat at least the original employees fairly, but some of them thought they weren't. And what do you think, as far as like as a board member, your responsibility to the scientists and the clinicians versus the fiduciary duty to investors? Because I think you can argue for both, but when they're in conflict, you have to pick one, it seems.
yeah. So listen, so this of course is some time ago, right? So
Yeah,
and we have and I am of course aware there were discussions about interpretation of what is written, but I think ultimately the lawyers were very clear on how to make an interpretation. So I don't think there's a lot of light between that. And it was implemented. I think some of the expectations on the side of some of these employees was a bit different. That made and then people feel uncomfortable and they start discussing these things. But ultimately, if you look back in the very limited amount of years that people were involved in the company and the success that we created, and the opportunity they had to be part of that success, I don't think they were ultimately treated in an unfair way. They may see that differently, but from my perspective, that has been the result has been, I think, very beneficial for everybody that was involved.
Yeah, I like how it's interesting to me when I read the book. It's been like a year now, but Vardy kind of not just the story and the characters, but there's also a bit of there's undertones of the haves versus the worker, the owners versus the workers. Where does that line blur? Because the owners also do work, but then the workers feel some ownership, and it's like looking at these color spectrum. You don't know, you can't tell exactly when red becomes orange, but
Hey,
somewhere in
listen,
there.
yeah, but I mean, in venture-backed companies, I mean, we typically have incentive structures for people, right? So
Right.
we're all part of that. These were done according to common and rules of thumb that we use in the industry. Nothing strange about that.
Yeah.
Of course, and we see that more often in exits than when founders get not the multiple that they see the investors walk away with for whatever reason because of the way contracts have been drafted and
Yeah.
agreed upon. When it comes to the ultimate distributions, the time they may feel, hey, is this fair or not fair?
Yeah.
But then, yeah, this is according to what we agreed. So we can talk about for forever about how people feel about it, but this is what it is, right? And I think normally people sign up for a contract, they know what they're doing. These are professionals, they understand what the incentive program is, and they need to understand what the consequences in a form of exit. Of course, nobody can
Yeah.
predict whether it's going to be high or low. It can be nothing. It can be a significant amount. It can be a huge amount.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it is what it is, and they will have to deal with it. And sometimes the expectation level goes a little bit further, and then people start to be somewhat or very disappointed. That's
Those
sometimes
are called
what it is. But
entitlements.
we
I
we we, we as investors have to deal with these kind of emotions sometimes
Yes.
and then I try to always point them to the fact that, this also could have been nothing, right? So
Yeah.
you but I mean, I think in general, uh, when I talk to the some of the original people that I still have contact with, then there may still be some of that, but most of them are pretty okay for where they are.
I
So
think like capitalism is not fair. I mean, it's funny. When I was reading that book, I thought about Thomas Piketty's Capital, the famous
right,
R is greater than G. And it's like, that's literally, you don't need to read that book. You just know that equation. That's basically it's not fair. Like, the game for everybody should be, how do you become an investor, even if you start as an employee, because that's clearly
yeah,
the
yeah.
side with higher proportion for returning your
And I
capital.
think it's not only on that level, right? So if we invest as a small investment group and a new investor comes in, right? We take the initial risk,
Hmm.
right? We build a company, a new investor comes in. You know what happens if there's a distribution? He gets his money first back, and then we.
Hmm.
So in a typical industry waterfall. So is that fair? Would you consider that fair? I
No.
mean, he comes in late. This new investor comes in
Yeah.
later. We get to an exit. We are in this company, let's say 5 years. They're
Hmm.
2 years. Distribution comes. I hope to get something, but they get that first.
Yeah.
So I mean that's the way it works. And the reason is they say, listen, we are putting this money at risk in this company, and when there's an exit, we want to be the first ones to get to see a return.
And
And
usually their valuation's like order of magnitude higher than yours.
of
So
course, and you
yeah.
hope to do the high evaluation, etc. But
Hmm.
still, and particularly founders that are usually at the very bottom with the rest of
Hmm.
the staff of that waterfall can feel a little bit disgruntled at such a time. But normally, ultimately, they get their fair share. So
Do you think
in my
founders
view.
learn this? Do you think the founders eventually learn this and say, "Hey, when I have a successful exit, I'm gonna try to be like Edward," right? That's really where the game, to me, that's like where the ultimate game is. It's until they change capitalism, right? Then
I
that's
don't
the
know. I don't
ultimate.
know. There's a whole lot of very successful entrepreneurs that also became investors for sure, including people from that have been involved in Asserta, that have very successfully set up other companies or are now running venture funds. So it
Hmm.
could be, but I mean, there is that's very much dependent on the person, etc. Some people are very happy if they get some money and they walk away and they just, pay off the mortgage of their house and live forever after happy. So that's also
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, that's a good point. As we wrap up, and thank you for your time, by the way, this has been great. Uh, BGV's model is described
No
as
problem.
venture creation.
Yes,
So you're not waiting for entrepreneurs to pitch you. You're identifying science in universities and pharma portfolios, recruiting the team, build the company from scratch. Um, how do you personally, or I'm assuming maybe you have a team that
we
finds
have a
the
team as well.
science?
Yeah.
Okay, so they find the science before anyone else kind of is interested, right?
That's the idea. At least for about 50% of our portfolio, we try to build these what we call create opportunities. So indeed, build companies from scratch around a great idea, maybe hopefully some IP as well, in these from these academic centers or anywhere. That can also be from as in the example of a sort of from a pharma company. But in any case, sorry for a little bit more than majority of the opportunities, we do that indeed. Yeah, yeah. But
Synap
we are 10 people. I'm not alone here. So
well, Synaffix sold to Lonza for 160 million euros.
yes,
You've got a whole portfolio following what looks like the same playbook. So I'm assuming you think the model is replicable, or
I
what's the
think so.
hardest
Not
part too?
necessarily, and early stage investing in life sciences is not necessarily easy. You need to be very much aware what is cool and what is not, because it can sometimes take a long time. And Synaffix is a nice example because it took us 10 years to get to an exit. Great exit. We're still very happy with it. But when we invested, at that time, ADCs looked like the new kid in town, and everybody was very excited, and that waned very quickly to no interest whatsoever after a couple of years. This was like 2014, 15.
Hmm.
Pharma was not really interested anymore. And then after the successes in the clinic of some of the, particularly the Daiichi Sankyo compound and the deal with AZ, then everybody started to get completely excited again. And then, of course, Cineplex could ride that wave, and they did that very well, and were able to generate a nice profit, which allowed us to sell it ultimately to Lonza. Yeah,
And
but yes, it's a playbook that is not always fully predictable. Let's put it this way.
right, but you try to systematize what you can, I'm
Of
assuming.
course, of course. Yeah, yeah,
So the BGV Fund 5, I think, raised 150 million euros in
yes,
2023. Your LP base limited partners includes Eli Lilly, Novo, Bristol Myers Squibb.
yes.
When strategics are your LPs, does that change your
Mhm.
incentives around exit timing or who you'll partner with on a deal?
Not really, not really. They are also not the major LPs in our fund, but they are important to us because of the ecosystem and the network that we create with that. So we get their feedback, we get their ideas around certain therapeutic areas, about modalities that they're interested in. We know what they are looking for, and some of them also want to co-invest. So it's a good way to have a good level of information
I see.
around what we're doing. And they, of course, are also interested to see what's happening in Europe. So, and they use us in a way to get a little bit more information about what stuff is going on there.
Okay. Yeah, the way Lily, I watched the Cheeky Pints podcast with Dave Ricks on from Eli Lilly, and he was talking. They're almost $1 trillion market cap now, and they were talking about how they still operate like a small independent, but then they have their own incubators, and I think there's some
Yep.
maybe some similarities to BGV in that regard.
I mean, as you mentioned, they are an LP in our fund, and we talk to them on a regular basis. It's a great group to talk to, of course, and they are on a high for sure. So they're doing very well. So we really appreciate that collaboration with them, and they have been very active across Europe, not only in our fund. They have
Yeah.
done a lot of work to make sure that they see the whole space. Yeah.
As a research site owner, they're my favorite sponsor by far to work with. They've
Are they?
never,
Okay, great.
yeah,
Yeah.
as long as you do good on your data and don't mess up with their protocols, they're the best. They'll pay more than usually it's like they'll most companies pay you every month, but really it's every 3 months because they're,
Right.
behind. Lily will pay sometimes multiple times a month. Like you are up to date as long as you're treating them well, but that as soon as you don't do something, what happened with that Susar? Oh, you're late to, addressing that. Oh, no, no. I mean, we're gonna,
Mhm.
not coming at you with the next study. So the site owners out there, they love Eli Lilly. They're by far the best currently. Currently.
Yeah, I mean, and they're really growing, right? So they're
Hmm.
looking at
Hmm.
different therapeutic areas and so forth. So it's really exciting to see how they will manage that growth.
Um, Last question, I guess. Okay, we
Sure.
talked about in the beginning too. The European scientific culture, American capital. Why do you mentioned why you think Europe's leaving money on the table, and you wouldn't be doing this if you thought there wasn't opportunities there. But people who are maybe in my industry close to the patients but far from the capital, they don't really understand how this works.
Yeah.
Whether Europe or the United States, what do they fundamentally misunderstand about drug development decisions, in your opinion?
You mean in Europe?
Either, yeah, Europe or the US. Like, what do they fundamentally misunderstand about this capital allocation when it comes to drug development?
Well, I'm not sure it's a really misunderstanding, but if our companies work with CROs either in Europe or US or wherever, I mean, of course, these biotechs are really very focused on what they're doing, right? So, and they need to, and they don't have the breadth of projects or for them, this is their livelihood, and that means that of course they expect the kind of attention from CROs as well, which is not always what they're getting, right? So because if you're a small
Wow.
company, as you can imagine, and you go to one of those big brothers in clinical research,
I keep
uh,
ya, PPD,
exactly,
senior.
and you may not be on the top of their list. So and we could be a bit, and of course, sometimes these teams consist of people that have not done like a 20 trials before, right? So in essence, we need to that if you have that understanding, and some of the CROs, I'm not going to name names, but some of the CROs we work with do have that understanding or want to collaborate, and they also look to venture funds to say, hey, you have a portfolio of companies, i.e., also a portfolio of potential programs that you could work with us on. You're a client like almost like a pharma company, and that if you get that, that's a really interesting point of view, and then can have a really good discussion with. So and that's something that we really also try to do, and we're actually doing that with some of those players. Yeah.
That's a podcast episode right there. That I did not expect you to go that route, but it's so true. Like most of the people I talk to, hey, these heroes not really prioritizing we're not Eli Lilly, so they
No,
they
but
don't care.
if you use the leverage of the people that support you as a
Mm,
biotech, you should be able to do that because they do understand that if they do a great job, then the next company we will probably advise them to go with that particular
right,
group again because we
right,
know them and so forth. It's like human nature, right? So
right.
once you know and trust these people and their organizations, it becomes a lot easier.
I never thought it. Yes, that you're right. That's a really good. Really good point. I'm glad we ended on that note because that brings it home
Cool.
for my audience. But Edward, I really appreciate your time. This is amazing. If you want people to connect with you, where do you prefer they go?
They can go to the info@biogeneration.vc email
Okay.
to our website. That's the easiest probably. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. Everybody go there, check it out. I really appreciate it. If you
Thank you,
ever want to
Dan.
come
Much
on for a
appreciated.
part two, we can talk CRO. That's a lot of people will be interested in that one.
Okay, happy to do so. There's probably also other people in our group that can help you there, but happy to do so. All right, thank
Perfect.
you.
Perfect.
Thank you again for the invite, and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye bye, everybody.